Did World War I and all subsequent wars fulfill a feature of the sign at Matthew 24 verse 7 when Jesus said, "For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom"? Did World War I happen unexpectedly, catching the world by surprise? Was it the First World War? Was it the worst war in human history up until that point? Since that time, have wars increased in number and frequency? Here are a few facts you may want to consider. Things before 1914 were hardly a time of peace and optimism. The book, A History of the Modern World Since 1815, says, few people wanted war. All but a few sensational writers preferred peace in Europe, but all took it for granted that war would come someday. In the last years before 1914, the idea that war was bound to break out sooner or later probably made some statesmen in some countries more willing to unleash it. Therefore, the great European conflict that came to be called World War I was not unexpected. It had been brewing for some decades. Then, in 1908, Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, leading to a political crisis. In 1912, the First Balkan War broke out, in which there were over 160,000 dead. This was followed by a Second Balkan War in 1913, where over 50,000 died. The region was destabilized, leading up to the assassination of Austria's Archduke Ferdinand by a Bosnian militant when he was visiting Sarajevo. Events quickly escalated from there. On one side, there were the Allied forces, 10 nations, who warred against the 4 nations called the Central Powers. In all, 15 million died, both soldiers and civilians. These are pretty dire statistics, but let us put them in perspective. General Montgomery, who fought in World War I and II, said this, "However, all in all, it can be said that the war in theaters outside Europe was of minor strategical importance. The 1914 to 1918 war was essentially a European war. It came later to be called a world war because contingents from many parts of the British Empire served in Europe, and because the United States joined the Entente powers in 1917. But, in reality, since the role of sea power was mostly passive, this was less a world war than some previous conflicts, such as the 7 Years' War." Despite this European war that started in 1914 being called World War I, it was not the First World War. A world war is a war affecting most of the world's most powerful and populous countries. World wars span multiple countries on multiple continents, with battles fought in multiple theaters. There are many wars previous to World War I that fit the classification of a world war. For instance, the 18th century saw the beginning of 4 world wars: the War of Spanish Succession, the 7 Years' War, the War of American Independence, the Napoleonic Wars. World War I was not the first total war either. A total war is defined as a war in which every available weapon is used and the nation's full financial resources are devoted. In the 13th century, the Mongols practiced total warfare. One reference says, as an aggressor nation, the ancient Mongols, no less than the modern Nazis, practiced total war against an enemy by organizing all available resources, including military personnel, non-combatant workers, intelligence, transport, money, and provisions. The Napoleonic Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, and the American Civil War were all examples of total war. Neither was the death toll for World War I greater than conflicts that preceded it. For instance, the Taiping Rebellion cost 20 million lives. The conquest of the Ming Dynasty cost 25 million lives. And the Mongolian invasions of the 13th century cost 30 million lives, the worst loss of life up until World War II. Therefore, World War I was not the first world war, nor the first total war, nor was it greater than any or all the wars that preceded it. As cause leads to effect, the causes of World War I had been building for decades and long anticipated. The world before 1914 was not a golden age of peace by any means. One scholar said, if, however, someone would start to talk about the good old days, about the long period of peace from 1871 to 1914, he should just open the closed pages of the history book. The Boer War in South Africa, the Boxer Rebellion in China, the Russo-Japanese War, the Illander Rebellion in Macedonia, the Balkan Wars and the occupation of Bosnia, the war between Italy and Abyssinia, the Mahdi Rebellion, the Herero Rebellion in German Southwest Africa, the wars between the Berbers and the French in Algeria, wars in Indochina, revolutions in South America. And this is just a selection from among the war events during this long peace period. Since 1914, have wars and victims of war increased in proportion to the human population? Does war play a greater part in the life of mankind in general today? The evidence does not show this to be the case. World War II, while likely the worst war in human history, ushered in the longest peace period Europe has ever known, that far exceeded the so-called peace period preceding 1914. While there has been wars in various parts of the world, there are many areas that have never seen combat upon their soil in their generation. Since World War II, deaths from warfare have not increased, but rather been on the wane. There are many scholars who have studied the subject of war in detail. Quincy Wright, in the book A Study in War, studied wars that involved over 50,000 combatants. From the year 1480 to 1900, there were 60 wars on average per century. From 1900 to 1964, there were 30. There does not appear to be an increase in frequency. Modern technology, while it has improved the quality of life for billions, has made warfare increasingly destructive. But Quincy Wright has found that wars decreased in length. Singer and Small, in the book The Wages of War, 1916 to 1965, studied international warfare during that period. From 1816 to 1864, there were 35 wars. From 1865 to 1913, there were 33. From 1914 to 1965, there were 25 international wars. 68 wars occurred before 1914, while 25 occurred from the 51 years from 1914 to 1965. Therefore, there has been no increase in the frequency of international warfare. Stephen Pinker said, violence has been in the decline over long stretches of history, and today we are probably living in the most peaceful moment of our species' time on Earth. According to anthropologists like Lawrence Keeley, Stephen LeBlanc, Philip Walker, and Bruce Knopf, these factors combine to yield population-wide rates of death in tribal warfare that dwarf those of modern times. If the wars of the 20th century had killed the same proportion of the population that die in wars of a typical tribal society, there would have been 2 billion deaths, not 100 million. According to the Human Security Brief 2006, the number of battle deaths in interstate wars has declined from more than 65,000 per year in the 1950s to less than 2,000 per year in this decade. Even if that is perhaps too optimistic a picture, Francis Beer, in his book Peace Against War, presents a more moderate statement by saying, unlikely as it sounds, there has been no significant change over time in the incidence of peace and war and in the casualties of violence. Jesus warned against getting alarmed at wars and reports of wars, because he knew throughout history nation would rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom.